In the quietest hours of his life, Arthur Schopenhauer uncovered a truth so devastating that it would forever change how sensitive souls navigate our world. It wasn't his reputation as the philosopher of pessimism that made his work dangerous. It was his recognition that the very structure of existence is arranged to crush those who feel most deeply. What he discovered through years of solitary contemplation was not merely a philosophical position, but a profound insight into why sensitive people suffer so intensely in a world that seems deliberately constructed to break them. You've felt it, haven't you? That persistent sense of being out of place in a harsh world, as if your capacity to feel deeply is somehow a design flaw rather than a gift. The exhaustion that comes from processing every stimulus more intensely than others. The overwhelming bombardment of a world that never stops demanding your attention, your energy, your very essence. This is not weakness or imagination. Schopenhauer identified this as the inevitable consequence of the world, as will and representation, a reality that sensitive souls perceive more clearly than anyone else. Schopenhauer himself was one of these sensitive souls. Born in 1788 to a wealthy merchant family, he experienced from an early age what he later called the fundamental misery of existence. While traveling across Europe as a young man, he witnessed human suffering in all its forms, poverty, disease, cruelty, and was profoundly affected by it in ways that others around him seemed able to simply ignore. This wasn't just philosophical curiosity. It was the painful recognition of a sensitive being confronting the harshness of reality. What makes Schopenhauer's insight so rare and valuable is that he identified something most philosophers before him had missed: the double burden carried by sensitive people. Not only do they suffer more intensely from life's inevitable pains, but they also perceive more clearly the underlying mechanisms that guarantee this suffering will continue. This perception doesn't make them weaker. It makes them the most honest witnesses to the nature of existence. The central problem Schopenhauer identified is what he called the will, not merely human will or desire, but a blind, insatiable force that constitutes the inner nature of everything in the world. This will manifest in humans as endless desire, constant striving, and perpetual dissatisfaction. For most people, this creates a baseline of discontent they learn to tolerate. But for sensitive souls, the relentless pressure of the will becomes an unbearable weight. Here lies the moment of revelation in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Sensitive people aren't maladapted to reality. They're actually perceiving it more accurately than others. The very qualities that make them vulnerable, their heightened perception, emotional depth, and capacity for empathy, also allow them to see through what Schopenhauer called the veil of Maya, the illusion that conceals the harsh truth about existence from most people. Look around at the empirical evidence. Studies in neuroscience now confirm what Schopenhauer intuited 2 centuries ago. Research on high sensitivity shows that approximately 20% of the population has a nervous system that processes stimuli more deeply and thoroughly than others. These highly sensitive people react more strongly to both negative and positive experiences. They notice subtleties others miss. They reflect more deeply on their experiences. And they often feel overwhelmed in environments that others find merely stimulating. The disturbing aspect of this reality is that modern society seems specifically engineered to maximize the suffering of sensitive people. Constant noise, endless information, relentless competition, and the devaluation of contemplation and solitude, all these features of contemporary life represent the triumph of the will in its most aggressive form. The sensitive person in this environment is like a finely tuned instrument being played with hammers. Schopenhauer's insights weren't mere speculation. His philosophy draws deeply from both Western philosophical traditions and Eastern wisdom, particularly Buddhism. Long before psychological studies confirmed the existence of sensory processing sensitivity, Schopenhauer had identified its fundamental characteristics and explained why such sensitivity would inevitably lead to suffering in a world driven by blind will. What Schopenhauer called the will operates through all of nature as an endless striving without purpose or satisfaction. In humans, this manifests as desire. We want something, struggle to get it, briefly enjoy it, and then either become bored with it or find ourselves desiring something else. This perpetual cycle of desire, temporary satisfaction, and renewed desire keeps most people busy enough not to question the fundamental structure of existence. But sensitive souls feel every turn of this wheel with excruciating clarity. The main danger for sensitive people lies not in their sensitivity itself, but in misinterpreting it as a personal failing rather than a clearer perception of reality. Society consistently reinforces the message that sensitivity is weakness, that emotional depth is impractical, that seeing the truth about the world's suffering is somehow morbid or unhealthy. This gaslighting compounds the suffering by adding shame and self-doubt to an already heavy burden. Beyond this primary danger lies a secondary problem: the temptation for sensitive souls to numb themselves. Schopenhauer observed how people seek to escape from the painful awareness of the will through various forms of distraction and intoxication. In his time, this might have meant alcohol or mindless entertainment. Today, our options for numbing ourselves are practically limitless. Social media, substances, consumerism, overwork, all promising temporary relief from the pain of clear perception. The psychological impact of being sensitive in a world designed to break sensitivity is profound. Many sensitive people internalize the message that there is something wrong with them. They learn to hide their true nature, to perform a kind of emotional dampening that allows them to function in environments hostile to their natural way of being. This performance exacts a terrible cost: anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, and a deep sense of alienation from both themselves and others. This pattern repeats itself across cultures and throughout history. Sensitive souls emerge, perceive the world clearly, suffer intensely, and then either find ways to protect themselves or are broken by the experience. Some turn to art, as Schopenhauer suggested, was one path to temporary liberation from the will. Others seek solitude and simplicity. Many are drawn to spiritual practices that acknowledge the reality of suffering rather than denying it. But almost all experience periods of despair when the weight of clear perception becomes too heavy to bear. The resistance that sensitive people encounter isn't accidental. Schopenhauer understood that the will perpetuates itself partly through collective denial of its existence. Those who point out the endless striving and fundamental dissatisfaction at the heart of human experience are often met with hostility precisely because they threaten the illusions that make life bearable for others. The sensitive person becomes the unwelcome truth-teller, the child pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. This resistance manifests as a collective phenomenon that pathologizes sensitivity while normalizing the relentless pursuit of desire satisfaction. Consider how our culture celebrates ambition, acquisition, and constant activity while treating contemplation, caution, and emotional depth as problems to be overcome. The sensitive person who questions this arrangement isn't just challenging cultural norms, they're threatening the very mechanism through which the will maintains its power. Schopenhauer observed systematic patterns in how sensitive people respond to this hostile environment. Some retreat entirely, seeking refuge in solitude and minimizing their contact with a world that causes them pain. Others attempt to build armor around their sensitivity, developing protective personas that bear little resemblance to their authentic selves. Still others channel their sensitivity into creative expression, finding in art a temporary escape from the tyranny of the will. These responses can be categorized into 4 distinct types, each representing a different relationship between sensitivity and the world's harshness. Understanding which pattern most closely resembles your own experience is the first step toward developing a more conscious relationship with your sensitivity. The first type is what Schopenhauer might call the naive sensitive, one who hasn't yet recognized the fundamental nature of the will and still believes their suffering is either temporary or fixable through the right life adjustments. These sensitive souls continue to throw themselves against the walls of reality, hoping to find the one approach that will allow them to feel at home in the world. Their innocence gives them a certain resilience, but also leaves them vulnerable to repeated disappointment and eventual disillusionment. The second type is the embittered sensitive, one who has recognized the nature of the will and responded with anger and resentment. These sensitive souls have seen through the illusions that comfort others, but rather than finding liberation in this clarity, they've become trapped in a cycle of bitterness about the world's essential nature. Their perception is accurate, but their response perpetuates their suffering by keeping them engaged in futile resistance against reality itself. The third type is what we might call the strategic sensitive, one who has developed sophisticated methods for navigating a harsh world while protecting their inner depth. These sensitive souls create careful boundaries, select their environments with precision, and develop practices that allow them to metabolize their intense experiences. They've accepted their sensitivity as neither good nor bad, but simply as the lens through which they perceive reality. The fourth type, and the rarest, is what Schopenhauer identified as the enlightened sensitive, one who has not only recognized the nature of the will, but has found ways to temporarily transcend it. These sensitive souls have discovered what Schopenhauer called the quieting of the will through aesthetic contemplation, compassionate action, or ascetic practices. Their sensitivity becomes not just a source of suffering, but a gateway to the most profound liberation possible in a world driven by blind striving. The integration process for sensitive souls involves movement through these different types, though not necessarily in a linear fashion. Many cycle between strategies, experiencing periods of naivety followed by bitterness, then developing strategic approaches before catching glimpses of more profound liberation. The danger lies in becoming stuck in the earlier stages, particularly in the phase of embittered sensitivity that can lead to despair. This integration process carries significant dangers. The sensitive soul who becomes aware of the fundamental nature of existence faces what Schopenhauer recognized as a terrible choice: either continue to see clearly and suffer accordingly, or find ways to dull perception and rejoin the less conscious majority. The first path risks despair, the second guarantees a kind of spiritual death. The challenge is finding a third way, maintaining clarity of perception while developing the inner resources to bear it. Examples of this struggle abound, both negative and positive. Consider the sensitive artists who, unable to bear the clarity of their perception, have sought refuge in self-destruction. Or the sensitive thinkers who, like Schopenhauer himself, withdrew so completely from the world that they sacrificed the richness of human connection. These negative examples reveal the dangers awaiting the sensitive soul who lacks effective strategies for living with their gift of perception. But there are positive examples as well, sensitive souls who have found ways to thrive precisely because of rather than despite their sensitivity. These individuals have typically developed several key capacities: the ability to create boundaries without building walls, the wisdom to choose environments that support rather than deplete them, the courage to speak their truth without expecting the world to conform to their perception, and the discipline to engage in practices that renew their capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. The personal transformation for sensitive souls follows recognizable stages. The first is awakening, the often painful recognition that one's sensitivity is not a personal failing, but a different way of experiencing reality. The second is grieving, mourning the loss of the illusion that the world could ever be made comfortable for the sensitive perceiver. The third is strategizing, developing practical approaches to protect one's sensitivity without diminishing it. The fourth is embodying, learning to live fully as a sensitive being rather than constantly fighting against one's nature. This transformation requires moving through several distinct challenges. Sensitive souls must learn to distinguish between the suffering that comes from resistance to reality and the suffering that comes from clear perception of reality. They must develop the capacity to be present with intense experience without being overwhelmed by it. They must build a relationship with sensitivity that recognizes both its gifts and its vulnerabilities, without idealizing or denigrating either. The most common traps for sensitive souls are precisely what Schopenhauer identified in his analysis of human responses to suffering. The first is distraction, the endless pursuit of novelty that keeps one too busy to feel deeply or think clearly. The second is numbing, the use of substances or behaviors that temporarily dull the capacity for perception. The third is intellectualization, the attempt to think one's way out of feeling deeply. The fourth, and perhaps most dangerous, is spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual concepts to deny or avoid the reality of suffering. Warnings for sensitive souls reflect Schopenhauer's hard-won wisdom. Beware of the promise of permanent happiness. It is a mirage that leads only to disappointment. Recognize that sensitivity will always involve suffering as well as joy. The capacity for depth of experience encompasses the full spectrum of human emotion. Understand that the world will never fully accommodate sensitivity. The burden of adaptation will always fall more heavily on those who perceive more clearly. Accept that periods of withdrawal are not failure, but necessary restoration for the sensitive spirit. Maintaining sensitivity in a harsh world requires what Schopenhauer called the denial of the will, not through self-destruction, but through practices that temporarily quiet the endless striving at the core of existence. For sensitive souls, these practices are not luxury but necessity. Regular immersion in art, nature, and contemplative silence provides essential respite from the tyranny of the will. Carefully chosen relationships with others who respect, rather than exploit sensitivity, create spaces of genuine connection without exhaustion. Higher integration comes when sensitive souls recognize what Schopenhauer identified as the ultimate truth beyond the will, the unity of all being. When sensitivity is experienced not as a personal attribute, but as a capacity to perceive the interconnectedness of all suffering and all joy, it transforms from burden to gift. The sensitive soul no longer experiences themselves as a fragile individual being crushed by a harsh world, but as the world itself becoming conscious of both its suffering and its beauty. Let's pause for a moment. As we explore how Schopenhauer revealed this profound tension between sensitivity and the world's harshness, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever felt a crushing weight of perception, noticing everything that others seem to easily ignore, feeling deeply what others barely register? That moment when you realize your sensitivity makes you both uniquely perceptive and uniquely vulnerable at the same time. I know it's difficult to acknowledge, because we live in a world that consistently rewards thick skin and quick recovery. But if you're willing, leave a comment saying, "I recognize that burden of perception when me," and complete it with your experience. Your words might be exactly what another sensitive soul needs to read today, to feel less alone. Sometimes naming our experience is the first step toward transforming it, and Schopenhauer gives us the language to do exactly that. Let's continue now with how this philosopher reveals an unexpected path forward for those who feel too much in a world designed to break them. In his final synthesis, Schopenhauer offers what seems paradoxical. The very sensitivity that makes existence so painful also offers the greatest possibility for liberation. While most people remain trapped in what he called the principium individuationis, the illusion of separateness that keeps the will cycling through endless desire, sensitive souls have the capacity to perceive the underlying unity of all things. This perception doesn't erase suffering, but it transforms its meaning. The highest wisdom for sensitive souls isn't found in becoming less sensitive, but in directing that sensitivity toward what Schopenhauer considered the only genuinely worthwhile human experiences: aesthetic contemplation that temporarily liberates us from the will, compassion that recognizes the same suffering in all beings, and the quieting of desire that brings moments of genuine peace. These experiences aren't merely pleasant alternatives to suffering. They represent brief glimpses into what exists beyond the endless striving of the will. For sensitive people navigating a harsh world, Schopenhauer's insights offer both challenge and comfort. The challenge is to accept that sensitivity will always involve suffering in a world driven by blind will. The comfort is knowing that this suffering isn't meaningless, nor is it a personal failing. It is the inevitable consequence of seeing clearly in a world where illusion is the norm. And this clarity, painful though it may be, is also the precondition for the most profound forms of human experience. What does this mean for your daily existence as a sensitive soul? It means recognizing that your struggle isn't a sign of weakness, but of perception. It means developing practices that protect your sensitivity without diminishing it. It means choosing environments and relationships that respect rather than exploit your depth of feeling. Most importantly, it means understanding that in a world designed to break sensitive souls, the act of continuing to feel deeply is itself a form of quiet heroism. Schopenhauer himself found solace in simple routines, in his devoted relationship with his dogs, in daily walks regardless of weather, in the consolations of great art and music, and in the discipline of his philosophical work. These weren't distractions from reality, but ways of engaging with it that honored both its suffering and its beauty. For sensitive souls today, similar practices, adjusted for individual temperament and circumstance, Offer pathways to live fully without being destroyed by the very perceptiveness that makes life rich and meaningful. If you've recognized yourself in this exploration of sensitivity in a harsh world, if you felt that painful clarity of perception that Schopenhauer described, you're not alone on this path. This conversation is meant as a refuge for those who perceive too clearly and feel too deeply, not to reinforce pessimism, but to validate your experience and offer pathways toward authentic thriving. I invite you to subscribe, not as another number, but as part of a community of sensitive perceivers who dare to remain awake in a world that rewards numbness. Every week we explore these philosophical truths together and how to apply them to protect our sensitivity in a world that seems designed to crush it. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of Schopenhauer's understanding of sensitivity resonates most deeply with you. I take time to read each reflection and respond personally. And if you know another sensitive soul who's struggling to find their way, share this with them. Sometimes the understanding we need most comes through those who recognize our experience. I'll see you in our next exploration, where we'll delve into Schopenhauer's insights about how art offers sensitive souls moments of genuine liberation from the tyranny of the will. Until then, remember, your sensitivity isn't a design flaw. It's your greatest capacity for both suffering and liberation. The journey of the sensitive soul through a world designed to break sensitivity follows a pattern Schopenhauer identified with remarkable precision. It begins with the innocent suffering of a heart that feels too much, progresses through the disillusionment that comes with seeing too clearly, and for those who find their way, culminates in a transformed relationship with both sensitivity and suffering. This path isn't linear but cyclical, with each turn of the wheel offering new depths of understanding for those brave enough to remain conscious through the process. Consider the early manifestations of sensitivity that Schopenhauer observed both in himself and others. The sensitive child experiences the world as an overwhelming barrage of sensations, emotions, and energies. While other children seem able to filter this input naturally, the sensitive child absorbs everything. The tension in their parents' relationship, the unstated emotions of their teachers, the subtle social hierarchies of their peers. What others experience as normal, they experience as assault. This heightened perception creates what psychologists now call the differential susceptibility that Schopenhauer intuited. Sensitive people react more strongly to both negative and positive environments. A harsh word that might bounce off another child penetrates the sensitive child to their core, but equally, a moment of beauty or tenderness can fill them with a rapture others rarely experience. This dual capacity for suffering and joy is the double-edged sword of sensitivity that Schopenhauer recognized as both curse and potential blessing. As the sensitive person matures, they encounter the first major crisis Schopenhauer identified, the recognition of their difference. While others seem able to move through the world with a comfortable imperviousness to much of its harshness, the sensitive person cannot help but perceive and process everything more deeply. This recognition often leads to the first attempts at adaptation, trying to become less sensitive, to develop the thicker skin that others seem to have naturally. These attempts at adaptation typically fail, leading to the second crisis, the realization that sensitivity is not a choice but an inherent way of being. What Schopenhauer understood, and what modern neuroscience confirms, is that sensitivity is largely an innate trait, with clear neurobiological markers. The sensitive person processes information more thoroughly, with greater activation in brain regions associated with awareness, empathy, and emotional processing. This isn't a psychological preference, but a physiological reality. The third crisis comes with the recognition that the world is not designed for sensitive people. As Schopenhauer observed, human society is arranged to facilitate the endless striving of the will, with little accommodation for those who perceive this arrangement too clearly or feel its effects too deeply. Economic systems reward aggression over reflection. Social systems privilege confidence over caution. Even educational systems typically value quick processing over deep consideration. This recognition leads many sensitive souls to what Schopenhauer identified as the great temptation, withdrawal from a world that seems fundamentally hostile to their nature. Schopenhauer himself yielded to this temptation, living much of his life in relative isolation with his dogs and books as his primary companions. While this withdrawal provided him the space to develop his philosophical insights, it also deprived him of the human connection that might have softened his pessimism. The alternative to withdrawal is what sensitive people throughout history have discovered through hard-won experience: the development of a relationship with sensitivity that acknowledges its vulnerabilities while honoring its gifts. This relationship doesn't eliminate suffering. Nothing can do that in a world constituted by will, as Schopenhauer rightly recognized, but it transforms suffering from a crushing weight to a bearable, even meaningful dimension of existence. Schopenhauer identified three paths through which sensitive souls might find temporary liberation from the tyranny of the will: aesthetic contemplation, compassionate recognition of universal suffering, and ascetic quieting of desire. Each of these represents not an escape from sensitivity, but a redirection of it toward experiences that transcend the endless cycle of desire and disappointment. For the modern sensitive person navigating a world even more overwhelming than the one Schopenhauer knew, these pathways remain relevant but require translation into practical approaches. Aesthetic contemplation becomes the regular immersion in arts that speak to the depth of human experience, rather than merely entertaining or distracting. Compassionate recognition becomes the cultivation of genuine connection with others based on shared vulnerability rather than social performance. Ascetic quieting becomes not the denial of the body's needs, but the simplification of life to reduce the stimulation that overwhelms sensitivity. What Schopenhauer could not fully articulate, living as he did in relative isolation, was the possibility of community among sensitive perceivers. While he correctly identified the universal nature of the will and the suffering it causes, he did not explore the potential for sensitive people to create environments together that honor rather than exhaust their perception. This represents perhaps the most important expansion of his philosophy for contemporary sensitive souls. Imagine spaces, physical and social, designed not to maximize the expression of the will through endless stimulation, competition, and acquisition, but to facilitate the clear perception and deep feeling that characterize sensitivity. These would not be spaces of mere comfort or escape, which Schopenhauer would rightly dismiss as another form of will-driven delusion. Rather, they would be spaces that acknowledge the reality of suffering, while creating conditions for the temporary transcendence that sensitive perception makes possible. The creation of such spaces requires what Schopenhauer considered the rarest human capacity: the ability to see beyond individual desire to the unity of all being. In practical terms, this means sensitive people recognizing each other not as separate sufferers, but as different expressions of the same fundamental capacity for perception. This recognition transforms isolation into connection without sacrificing the authenticity that Schopenhauer valued so highly. Consider the implications of this perspective for how sensitive people might relate to their own suffering. Rather than experiencing their pain as a personal burden or failure, they could recognize it as a particular manifestation of the universal suffering Schopenhauer identified as the essence of existence. This doesn't eliminate the pain, but it does transform its meaning from individual pathology to shared human condition. This transformation echoes what Schopenhauer found in his study of Buddhist philosophy: the recognition that suffering stems not from particular external circumstances, but from the nature of desire itself. For sensitive people, this insight offers a profound liberation from the endless attempt to arrange external conditions perfectly enough to avoid pain. The problem isn't the specific environment, but the fundamental structure of existence that sensitive people perceive more clearly than others. Yet Schopenhauer's engagement with Buddhist thought didn't lead him to the compassionate response that characterizes mature Buddhist practice. His recognition of universal suffering led more to resignation than to the active compassion that might have alleviated both his own pain and that of others. This represents both the limitation of his approach and the opportunity for contemporary sensitive souls to extend his insights in more life-affirming directions. The cultivation of compassion, beginning with self-compassion, offers sensitive people a response to suffering that neither denies its reality nor remains trapped in passive recognition of it. Schopenhauer correctly identified compassion as the only genuine virtue, arising from the recognition that the suffering of others is fundamentally one's own suffering. What he did not fully explore was how this compassion might be directed first toward one's own sensitivity, transforming self-judgment into self-understanding. For the sensitive person living in the overwhelming world of the 21st century, self-compassion isn't a luxury but a necessity. The barrage of stimulation, information, and expectation would break even the most resilient spirit without the protective capacity of genuine self-care. This doesn't mean indulgence, which Schopenhauer would rightly critique as another expression of the will. It means the conscious creation of conditions that allow sensitivity to exist without being crushed. These conditions include what might be called the practical wisdom of sensitivity, knowing when to engage and when to withdraw, when to express and when to contain, when to connect and when to protect. Schopenhauer's life, with its careful routines and deliberate limitations, exemplified some aspects of this wisdom, but his isolation also represented a significant sacrifice of the connection that sensitive souls need, not despite, but because of their depth of feeling. The balance between protection and connection represents perhaps the greatest challenge for sensitive people in a harsh world. Withdraw too completely, as Schopenhauer did, and you risk the bitterness that characterized much of his outlook. Engage too uncritically, and you risk being overwhelmed by a world designed to maximize will rather than perception. The middle path requires discernment that can only develop through experiment, reflection, and the guidance of others who have walked similar terrain. This guidance is precisely what Schopenhauer sought to provide through his philosophical writings. Despite his personal misanthropy, he was driven by the desire to articulate truths that might help others navigate the difficult terrain he had explored. His gift to sensitive souls wasn't optimism, he would have considered that dishonest, but clarity. By naming the mechanisms that guarantee suffering, he freed his readers from the confusion that compounds pain with bewilderment. For contemporary sensitive souls, this clarity remains the essential first step toward a life that honors, rather than hides perception. The recognition that one is not broken, but different, not too sensitive but perceiving accurately what others manage to ignore, creates the foundation for all other aspects of integration. This doesn't eliminate the practical challenges of navigating a world designed for less sensitive people, but it does transform those challenges from personal pathology to navigable difference. The practical strategies that emerge from this clarity reflect Schopenhauer's insights, while extending beyond his somewhat limited personal response. These include the deliberate creation of sanctuary, spaces, relationships, and activities that replenish rather than deplete sensitive perception. They include the cultivation of boundaries that protect without isolating, allowing selective rather than indiscriminate engagement with a stimulating world. They include practices that strengthen the capacity to be with intense experience without being overwhelmed by it. Most importantly, they include the recognition that sensitivity itself evolves through conscious engagement. The sensitive soul who understands their nature doesn't remain static, but develops increasing capacity to metabolize experience. What overwhelms at 20 may be merely challenging at 40 and fully integrable at 60. This evolution doesn't represent becoming less sensitive, but rather developing a more sophisticated relationship with sensitivity. Schopenhauer himself demonstrated this evolution, albeit incompletely. His early works express a more unmediated pessimism, while his later writings show greater capacity to hold the tension between clear perception of suffering and appreciation of temporary transcendence through art, nature, and philosophical contemplation. Had he found more genuine human connection, this evolution might have progressed further toward the compassionate wisdom that represents sensitivity's highest expression. This compassionate wisdom is what distinguishes the fourth type of sensitive soul, the enlightened sensitive, from the other three types Schopenhauer implicitly identified. The naive sensitive feels everything but understands little. The embittered sensitive understands the mechanisms of suffering but remains trapped in resistance to them. The strategic sensitive develops effective protection, but often at the cost of full engagement. Only the enlightened sensitive manages both to see clearly and to respond with a compassion that includes but transcends personal suffering. The path toward this enlightened sensitivity isn't one Schopenhauer himself fully walked, despite his profound insights into its nature. His personal bitterness and isolation prevented him from embodying the compassionate wisdom his philosophy pointed toward. This gap between insight and embodiment serves as both warning and invitation for contemporary sensitive souls, warning of the dangers of isolation, invitation to extend his insights through more connected living. What might this extension look like in practical terms? It would begin with the recognition Schopenhauer himself articulated, that sensitivity perceives accurately the nature of a reality driven by blind will. It would include his understanding that suffering is intrinsic to existence, rather than a personal failing. But it would move beyond his somewhat limited response to include the active cultivation of compassion, community, and creative engagement with the world despite its fundamental harshness. This engagement doesn't require denying the reality of suffering or pretending that the world is other than it is. Schopenhauer was right to critique the shallow optimism that ignores the depth of human pain. But engagement does require recognizing that sensitivity's gifts, depth of perception, capacity for compassion, appreciation of beauty, potential for genuine connection, make a full life possible despite rather than because of the world's design. The sensitive soul living this full life doesn't experience less suffering than Schopenhauer described. They feel the press of the will, the endless cycle of desire and disappointment, the harshness of a world designed for less perceptive beings. But they also experience the transcendent moments he identified, the quieting of the will through aesthetic contemplation, the dissolution of boundaries through compassionate recognition, the peace that comes with the temporary cessation of desire. Most importantly, they experience these transcendent moments not as rare exceptions to an otherwise bleak existence, but as the natural fruition of sensitivity itself. What Schopenhauer partially recognized, and what fully integrated sensitive souls discover through lived experience, is that sensitivity's greatest gift is the capacity to perceive beyond the veil of individuation to the unity that underlies all existence. This perception doesn't eliminate suffering, but it transforms it from meaningless burden to the very ground of compassion. For sensitive souls walking this path today, Schopenhauer remains an essential guide, not because he found all the answers, but because he asked the right questions. Why do sensitive people suffer so intensely in a world that seems designed to break them? Because they perceive more clearly than others the fundamental nature of existence. What makes this suffering bearable? Not its elimination, which is impossible, but its transformation through compassion, creativity, and the recognition of unity beyond individual experience. This transformation doesn't happen once, but continually, with each cycle of engagement and withdrawal, perception and integration, suffering and transcendence. The sensitive soul doesn't arrive at a state of permanent liberation from the will. Schopenhauer was right, that such permanent liberation is impossible in life, but they do develop an increasingly sophisticated relationship with both sensitivity and the world it perceives so clearly.